All right. Well, first of all, welcome and thank you all for joining. This is probably one of my favorite conversations because we really get to step back and look at the forest for the trees to really think about what's the end goal that we're trying to accomplish from a business perspective, and whether that exit strategy that you're trying to build for the organization is something that needs to happen in 1 year or 3 years versus 15 years. Anybody that works with a business coach will tell you that, right? We've got to start building with the end in mind. And so this is really thinking about, based on how the owners of the organization are thinking about what exit strategy needs to look like, how do you build into that in terms of how you approach the HR side of the house? And when we talk about strategy, there is oftentimes in organizations, you start with, you've got your business strategy over here and your HR strategy over here, and they're really two separate entities. And the way we view HR strategy is it starts with what's your business strategy and what are the business outcomes you want today and in the future. And then your HR strategy should just tuck up underneath that so that it is supporting those outcomes and goals. And so similarly, when we're talking about a business's exit strategy, you have what that exit strategy may look like, and there might be a few alternatives for what we want that to look like, but we have to make sure that the HR strategy that you build along the way will support that. And so as we go through today, we'll be taking time to really unpack what that means. For those of you that I have not met, I obviously am Katie, and we are specializing in HR solutions for small to mid-sized companies. And one of the things that we do and often do is start with this conversation around where do you ultimately want your business to go? And how do you build the HR strategy to get there? And sometimes as owners, we get really focused on, well, this is what I want to accomplish this year, but it's important to expand that, to think about, more importantly, how do you want to exit the business, even if that exit is 15, 20 years from now. I use my own example. I've only owned the business for 8 years. We've been building from scratch for 8 years. But when I started the business, I had a goal of where I want to be by year 10. And honestly, where I want to be by year 10 is at my exit strategy. Does not mean I intend to exit. That is not my plan at all. But I need to be in a position that if I needed to exit or decided I wanted to exit, I could do so in a way that left me with the livelihood that I personally need, but most importantly, also took care of the business and the team. And so as we think about that, no matter whether or not you actually plan to exit, you still have to have the strategy and, most importantly, the HR structure to help support that. We're going to talk about what that looks like as we go through today's conversation. I wanted to start in the most basic of places just to make sure we're all on the same page. When we talk about exit strategies, there are a lot of different versions of those. And these are kind of the most common, but I'll tell you, we've heard a lot along the way of what that exit can really look like for a business owner. So obviously you've got a merger or an acquisition that makes a big difference if you actually want to sell the business. Our last section of this webinar will actually talk about some really important things that come out from an HR due diligence perspective that are critical. Even if you want to sell the business 10 years from now, you've got to get some of this stuff right today to make sure that you do have sellable business from an HR due diligence perspective. We also have folks that are looking at family succession plans, right? We were just talking earlier today. It's to an owner who is a second generation family business, and they are hoping to at some point transition it to their third generation business. And so what does that look like, and what's unique from an HR perspective about that situation, and how do you prepare for it? The ESOP piece is the other option, and we do have a lot of clients. If you attended Jeffrey Scott's events a couple of weeks ago, Ryan's Landscaping that we visited is an ESOP. We've got a lot more companies that are going this route and starting to think about it. And even as you start preparing for it, there's some impact in terms of your structure that you want to think about. There's some impact in terms of some of your policies that you need to think through to make sure that the ESOP is set up for success. Similarly, though, some of the HR due diligence things that you need to take care of if you're going to sell the business, essentially in an ESOP, you're selling the business along the way, you're just selling it to employees. So you need to make sure that it would pass the HR due diligence tactics that you need to be aware of. Sometimes this is about selling to a partner, and that becomes, particularly as we talk about org structure, that becomes really clear. And then we have other owners who are trying to retire in place, right? They're essentially going to be out of the day-to-day business and someone else is running it and they're collecting checks, which is kind of that ideal retirement, but they don't need to be in the day-to-day of things. And so each of these different exit strategies has different issues that you need to address along the way from an HR perspective. If you've not read this book called Exit, Six Principles of, it's called Exit Rich. And it talks about 6 principles of building your exit strategy. And it's a book that, quite honestly, I read as a business owner, and I've now gone back and reread multiple times because it does make you think differently about the exit strategy. Even if you're not ready to exit today, there's things you need to do today to be ready for that time when it comes. I also tell my employees all of the time, we need to be focused on building a sellable business, even if I never intend to sell, because we are all human and we do not know what will happen. And if something happens to me, and in my case, I am a sole business owner, you do not want my husband doing your HR ever. And my team doesn't want my husband running my company. So in the event that something would happen to me, the company has to be in a position that it could operate in a way that would sustain my team and keep them from being at any risk, because anything else is just not responsible on my part. And so while I don't love to think in terms of possibility of negatives, it's a great way to help your team understand sellable is different than I am going to sell. Sellable means it is a profitable business that operates without you being in the middle of it, so that in the event somebody ever did need to take it over and run it, it would do that very seamlessly. And I think this is one of those things, it's always an evolution, because sellable at a small size versus when you double in size, you need new things in terms of that exit strategy. And again, even if you're going ESOP, even if you're going with retire in place, you still want it to meet all of the criteria of sellable so that you have options along the way. In this book, Exit Rich, which I don't love the title of, but the principles are fantastic. There's 6 key areas that she talks about that are really, really important to building that sellable company. And it's people, product, process, propriety, patents, and profits. Now, when we think about your HR strategy, people see these 6 principles and they immediately jump to the assumption that, okay, this is all about making sure that we've got people strategy. The reality of this entire process is when your HR strategy tucks up under your exit strategy, it's not limited to just this people category. It actually has impact on almost all 6 of these categories, but particularly 4 that are really, really key to building that strategy. Obviously, there's a ton under the people side that we need to think about. This is things like culture, your policies, talent, your structure is really key. Your comp and benefits program, and even like, do people have the right leadership skills? So all of that is really important in the people section. Then we have process, and this is where sometimes people miss that HR actually supports your process. And we're going to talk about this today of job descriptions and RACI charts and the impact that those can have on your process so that your structure works effectively. And so they really have big overlap. But if you don't have solid processes, then it's likely that the owner or the leaders can't get out of the middle of the day-to-day. The third piece is this proprietary piece. And so this is really about non-disclosure agreements and key person agreements. So we need to understand what are the things that you need to put in place to make sure that if you are going, for example, through a merger and acquisition, there are points and times where you need people to sign on, sign into these agreements. And there's things that you need to know in order to make that be effective. Now, obviously, there's, if you haven't already heard, there's a ton of new information in the news these days about non-compete agreements. Those actually got, there was a big announcement earlier this year that non-compete agreements were going to go away completely. And the date for that actually was over the summer. That got stalled by a federal judge out of Texas. And so that has not been, in fact, that date is not effective yet. And it's still unclear where this will go. We'll probably know by the end of the year what the ultimate ruling is on non-competes. That being said, I will tell you at the state level, sometimes they're illegal. We'll talk about that. And there's some danger to non-competes. So we're going to talk about that in general as well, because it's an important part of this whole strategy. And then the last section that really gets impacted by this is the concept of profits. And I know that sounds weird because we think about profits as impacting the owner, but it's really about things like bonus plans and stock plans you may want to offer. Do you do phantom stock options for for some of your key person agreements, things like that? Or do you go as far as having an actual ESOP? So we're going to go through each of these and talk about some of the most important factors in each of these different sections. And again, if you have questions, feel free to ask them along the way. We can always pause the recording, or we'll answer those at the end. But this people side, one of the places that I find it most helpful as we're thinking about your exit strategy is we have to start with thinking about your structure, because this structure, first of all, understanding which strategies you're considering. You may not know exactly which one you're going to take, but which one you're considering has to start with then what is the structure you need in order to be successful. And the challenge with this for small businesses is many of us, not only owners, but many of your leaders often wear multiple hats. They don't just have one role that they play from beginning to end all day, right? They have multiple roles. They just happen to move in and out of them. As an owner, sometimes you play owner, sometimes, but you also might be technically playing more of a GM role. Some of you play the controller position. So each of these different roles makes a difference. And when we don't have clarity on structure, it makes it really difficult to understand not only what are the people you need today, but more importantly, what are the roles that you need should you decide to exit. Now, this gets particularly complicated in situations like family succession plans. That is one of probably the more complicated, because often we have family members that have moved into different roles, and they may have moved into different roles not necessarily based on like, oh, I went to college to do this thing and this is what, and now I found a company where I get to do it. Sometimes they move into roles because that was a need that the family had at a given time, and they became the subject matter expert in that role. But would you feel, right, if that family member decided to go on to do something else, either run the business or leave the business, would you fill that role exactly the same way? And so where we find structure becomes really key in your exit strategies is we have to stop and think about not just how do we get the work done, but to be honest, I often will challenge owners that are going through the structure to think about, what if somebody gave you, a bank account full of money, as much money as you would ever need to run the business for 2 or 3 years, and the only criteria is you actually have to spend it to run the business, to build a sellable company. If that were the case, how would you structure the company in order to be the most effective? And so when we build your exit strategy, this is essentially what we're doing is, what's the structure you need for the company to be sellable and operate without you, the owner, in the middle of it, or the leadership team in the middle of it, right? The current people in the leadership team. And so we want to design the structure based on the roles you need, not the people you have. Because you likely have people that maybe wear a couple of hats that you smush together because somebody has a unique set of talents. Or when somebody left, another employee took something over. And so that's kind of become part of that job. But if that person won the $800 million lottery and sailed around the world, you probably wouldn't backfill the position exactly the same way. We just had a call yesterday with a client that's trying to create a new role based on the work that they need to get done. But the way they were designing it, it was very clear that like they were taking two roles that really should be separate, but they weren't full-time. So we pushed them together, but they're going to need very different skill sets in order for that to happen. And that gets dicey when you start to create roles that way. One, it's hard to find that unicorn talent. And two, it can be really difficult to, even when you find that person, to navigate the dynamics of your process, which we'll talk about in job descriptions. So when we design a structure based on the roles, not the people, we start by first figuring out not the list of the 100 things that somebody needs to do in order to be effective, but instead, what are the top 5 to 6 priorities for that particular position? And what percentage of time do you want somebody spending doing those particular priorities? And when we get into the job description discussion, I'm going to talk a little bit about why that's so important.
Yeah, but it's fine. Hold on.
But we really start thinking about this in terms of like, put the boxes on the page and imagine if you could start the business today from scratch and you had all the money to fill all of the roles that you have, that you need, what would those actually be? Because you want this on paper, knowing you're full well, you're not going to fill all of those roles from the beginning, but you need to know where you're headed so that when you get to the exit strategy, you have the right people in place. Now, one of the most important things, I see owners do this all the time. They go, great, Katie, I totally get that. And then they start at the bottom of the org chart to start building out what roles need to happen for the day-to-day activities to begin or to happen. We actually suggest reversing that process. You have to first understand, particularly when we're developing an org structure for an exit strategy, you have to understand what the role of the owner will look like. And subsequently, the other roles in the leadership team, because the role that the owner is going to play is critical to which roles you need underneath them. I use the landscape space as a really good example because this is really key. So many of our landscape clients, as they have envisioned an exit strategy, they aren't planning on exiting and just cruising around the world, right? They still want to be involved in their business, but they don't want to be involved in like the day-to-day stuff. Maybe visionary, right? They want to envision future things, but they need somebody else to sort of make sure that those are getting executed at different levels depending on their revenue size. But then the owner goes, but I still want to do stuff, right? They're not really ready to retire in place and just collect the check. They want to be involved. And what skills they bring and what brings them passion may look really different. For some of our owners, that's, hey, I want to just be a salesperson, right? I want to be a salesperson on the team and just come in and do my sales a couple hours a day. Sometimes our owners are saying, you know what, I have these relationships with all of these architects and different people that send us business. I want to go sit and have coffee with people all day and just drum up business. In other cases, right, their role is, Katie, I don't like, literally, I want to sit down once a quarter with whoever's running my business and I want to go over the financials. And that's the only time I want to see it. What you want that outcome to be, though, has dramatic impact on everything downstream. And so we need to start with what is the ideal role of the owner in the exit strategy. And then we start looking, when we're defining that, we really start looking at some key things like what percentage of their time do they want to spend on long-term vision and strategies? What percentage do they want to spend on coaching and developing team members? And again, not today, but in this future strategy. If they're selling the business, the answer to all of these is 0. So you need to make sure that the owner is out of all of these things today as you're building towards that exit strategy. You want to make sure you're building a structure that allows them to get further and further out of these things over time. How much time do they want to spend in the financials? That makes a big difference on whether or not you need a controller or not. And then also serving in an individual contributor role. Again, oftentimes that is a sales role, or sometimes it's the financial role, but where they want to go will make a difference on where the boxes on the page are. Here's a couple of sample ideas of the kinds of things that change as you look at the different exit strategies. For example, if you're looking at the possibility of doing a merger or an acquisition, then the goal that you need to accomplish is the business has to operate without the owner in the middle of it. When that's the case, then the leadership team model that you need is either having a single strong general manager that can manage department managers, or you need to build a division manager model where if you have multiple divisions, you put individuals at the division manager level, which is different than department manager level in terms of their roles and responsibilities and the amount of strategy work they're doing. But if the business owner is going to be out of it and you're not hiring a single GM type role, then you need really strong division managers that can analyze the business, build the vision, make sure that the strategies align with the outcomes to ensure that the business is profitable. That looks different than, for example, if we're looking at a family succession plan. In this case, this is more about smooth transition of leadership, right? You're not going to go externally necessarily and hire somebody because it might be a transition within the family, and that has to go well. The division manager model often works better in that situation than the GM model might look, because in this case, one, you may have multiple family members involved, and so you may have to allow many people to have leadership roles. In other cases, you may have a family succession plan that's farther out, and that person needs to learn the different areas and lead those different areas along the way. But again, if you're going to also, if it's further in that succession plan and the next generation is ready to step into the owner role, well, then they're probably going to step into that owner role as a sole owner, and having a GM in there won't make a lot of sense for them. It'll get clunky. And so them having division managers is a much smoother transition for folks. You can see from all of these, like there's a different version of the exit model depending on where the owner is going to go. So that first step becomes really, really critical. In the sell to a partner situation, that's one where truly you have to figure out, even within the owner job title, you have more than one person today. So you have to figure out which hats have each of the owners been wearing and who's going to need to take those owner responsibilities going forward. That could look really different for every single organization. Couple of things to keep in mind as you're doing this sort of org structure work is, again, when we're starting from the owner role, we need to think about, for the entire organization, what's the work that needs to get done? Not who needs to do it, but what is the work that we need to get done as the owner steps out and even as your leadership team starts to shift. You also have to think about, how would you organize work in the most logical way? Not how do we organize it today, because that's often based on the people that we have in roles or who picked up which hat on which day. But instead, what would it look like in an ideal world to organize the company the way that it would make sense in the future? The one I love, we talked about, right? If somebody gave you that pot of money and said, build the company any way you wanted and no salary expenses an issue, then not having the budget allows you to really think about, what are all the roles I would have to get to the revenue size and the exit strategy that I'm trying to accomplish? And most importantly, take names out of it. We can't think about, it doesn't mean we're going to all of a sudden like wipe out our entire team. But if we start thinking in terms of the roles and not the people, it allows us to think differently when somebody does leave the organization. It allows us to think about, hey, how might we transition this? Or how do we get closer to that exit strategy? I used this version as a sample. This is kind of People Solutions Center sample. It's not completely real. I left some things off of it for confidentiality purposes, but it gives you a good idea of kind of what we're thinking. So today, like if somebody gave me a pot of money and said, Katie, grow the business as much as you can, these are the roles that I know I would need. Now you'll notice that there's some different coloring in here, right? And this light blue today is one that's used very frequently. That's, as I put this all on paper of what are all the roles I would need, I had to color in what are all the roles I'm playing today. I'm at one of those tipping points in revenue, right? Where we're just about ready for some additional leadership that would help take me out of some of these hats. but all of this light blue coloring are hats that I wear today. That means my exit strategy needs to be a little further off because that's too many hats in one place in order for me to exit the business and let somebody else run it in a way that would be plausible. These darker blue colors are roles that are filled today by someone else. These are places where I've started to fill in. At one point, these were all me. So we're starting to fill in some of those roles with other team members and getting support. But you can see if I were evaluating my own company from a risk perspective on my exit strategy, way too many hats at the leadership level, all worn by the same person. But I know that this is where I want to go. So as I'm starting to evaluate, great, it's time for that next hire. And that hire needs to be a leader hire, not an individual contributor hire. How can I get closer to filling one of the roles at this level? Then we've got these two in orange. These are roles that I ultimately will want to fill in the organization. But today I've decided to use third-party vendors to make them happen. Now, the good part is that has less risk to it from an exit strategy, because if a third-party vendor is doing it for me today, if I got to go sail around the world for a year, the third-party vendor could keep doing it. So there's less risk to that than there is to the fact that today I have, right, multiple roles at the leadership level that are currently available. But the reason I show this is for each organization, this is ultimately what you want to put down on paper. Not just, don't even worry about what jobs you have in the organization today. Build the org structure the way you would want it to look, and then start using this color coding to think about, so where does that play out? How does this play out today? And what are our risk factors in terms of our exit strategy? All of that is really where your exit strategy has to start. Everything else we're going to talk about today ties back to, first and foremost, when we think about exit strategies, we have to make sure we've got this structure. Even if we're not there today, we have to understand what the structure would need to look like in order for the exit strategy to be successful. And that's different depending on which type of exit strategy you might be following. But it's a really important part of the work. Now it leads to process, because you need to start building those processes so that the team can operate that way. If I look back in my company, even 4 years ago, we were set up process-wise where everything had to flow through me, right? People had to wait for me to approve something. People had to wait for me to do something in order for them to be able to do their job. I was a bottleneck. Well, that's a huge problem in an exit strategy, because if I need to come out, if that's my exit strategy is for me to be out of the day-to-day, who's going to take care of the bottleneck? So we had to figure out processes and actually document processes, which is why I have my operations manager in place to create systems that work, that don't, nowhere in our processes does it say Katie will do X or Nicole will do X. And it doesn't say owner will do, unless the reason I'm doing that is because I'm in the owner role. And so if we go back to the other chart, for example, what you see in this is that when you look at our process documents, they actually have titles on them that say things like, the director of talent consulting will do X, because someday that's who I want doing that. Now, today, that's still my hat, but we've made processes that are defined by the job titles that we want to be doing things, not the who is doing the work today. And then we're just really clear with people on, like, which hats do you wear and why are you doing things? So let's talk about the two tools that are most important from a process perspective. And ironically, particularly job descriptions, people go, oh yeah, of course the HR people are talking about job descriptions, because we think we're supposed to talk about them because of the people side of developing people. And in particular, we think we're supposed to talk about them for compliance purposes. And while both of those are important, I would actually tell you that the reason the job descriptions are really critical when you're talking about exit strategy is it helps differentiate between what do we mean by how the role is being done today versus how it might be done in the future. I'm going to use an example that gets brought out quite a bit, particularly in the landscape space, but honestly, across the industries, we see this. And it's the difference between, do I have a department manager and do I have a division manager? And this really comes down to the responsibilities day to day are pretty similar. The buckets of work, the 5 priorities that each role is doing are similar. But what you can see by the way these job descriptions are broken out by percentages of time, how much of that work somebody is doing is different, which also means how strategic we want the person to be when they're doing it starts to shift. So for example, if I'm a division manager, I expect that about 40% of my time is about developing business strategies. So if you have a division manager role, your expectation is that that individual is looking at their reports, they're analyzing business outcomes, they're doing a SWOT analysis and talking about and thinking about, what do I need to do to fix this problem or grow the business to this point? A division manager is typically focused on looking at least 6 to 8 months out in the future on a regular basis to say, not just where are we today, but where do we want to be in the future? In comparison to that, on the department manager side, that same bucket of developing business strategies is only about 10%, because a department manager is typically more focused on, how do we make sure that the day-to-day activities are going well and that we're getting results today? And so it shifts, right? The other piece that shifted with that is that other 30% that was strategy work under the division manager. Under the department manager, that 30% is spent on real-time projects and outcomes. So you can see your division manager is only spending about 10% of their time on today, 40% on how do we get where we want to be in the future, compared to a department manager that is 30% on today and only 10% on where do we want to be in the future. But the skills that you need in order for somebody to do those 2 jobs are very, very different. And this is key for your exit strategy, because what I've seen is, as we start to build the org structures and we've got all of the boxes on the page, people then go, oh, okay, well, this person is my maintenance manager, so we're just going to put them in, they're in that role. Well, they might fall into that box, but they're doing that job like a department manager. And what you're going to need in order for the owner to pull out of the day-to-day is somebody doing that role as a division manager. And it's a different skill set, which either means we have to develop new skill sets in people that are doing the job today, or we need to determine that, you know what, maybe I do need to go out and find that division manager level talent and bring that talent into the organization to develop it up. Now, that's one of the reasons too, though, as you're building these job descriptions and really thinking about what you want it to look like, it's those kinds of changes that may have you thinking about, well, wait a minute, I don't have 3 people that could be ready for division manager jobs, but I've got 3 boxes that say division manager. I probably have 2, but not a third. What does that mean? Well, maybe while you're working towards an exit strategy, if it's not a near-term strategy, right, you might simply go with the 2 you have the owner keep the hat of the third, and do a succession plan to develop somebody up into the division manager role. If you've got probably 4 or 5 years, that plan could work really well. If you only have a year before you need the exit strategy to truly be ready to be executed, then it changes the outcome, and you probably need to think about, you know what, we need to go buy this talent from the external market. And yes, it's going to mean a tough conversation, but it's the way we need to go. But writing out the job descriptions with the top 5 priorities and the percentage of time they'll spend doing the right level of work, make sure that you're not just picking job titles from somebody else's org chart and not really understanding what has to happen. Because again, we're building towards an exit strategy, a vision you have for the future, not what do you need in order for the job to get done today. Where having this written down on paper can be particularly helpful is if you are trying to build this talent internally and you have somebody who maybe today is operating like a department manager and you need them to be a division manager in the future, what you really want them to do is understand how are those two things different. And by writing it down in a job description, you give them a visual depiction of here's where you are today, and that's great, but this is where I need you to be in the future, and these are different competencies. The second piece to this, besides the job description, is the concept of the RACI chart. And this is a huge process improvement. The great part is it helps your day to day, but it really helps in the org structure. And so the RACI chart is all about determining at every step of your process who's responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And the reason this is key is because, again, we don't use names, we use job titles, but there's a big difference between if I'm supposed to be in an exit strategy as the owner, and yet I'm the accountable, I'm the final decision maker on like 75% of our processes, well, then I can't exit. So even if I'm trying to sell the business, I want to be able to show in due diligence that, hey, we have this process. And look at how few times owner is the person who is involved. So you are buying a business that can operate without me needing to be a big piece of it. That will actually increase the value of your business considerably. The more the owner, the closer you get to your exit strategy, the fewer places your owner in their owner hat should be in the accountable and the consulted column. They really, and they should almost never be in the responsible column, other than responsible for things that somebody else could easily take over without needing the history, the knowledge, the technical expertise, or the skill set that's exactly the same as that particular owner. And so this looks very different. This is a sample. When we start working with organizations on exit strategy work, we actually have them envision this future state when they're exited the way that they want to. What are the things that where do they think the owner should be responsible, accountable, meaning, so doing the work, responsible, decision maker, accountable, consulted, meaning you have to get my opinion, but you don't necessarily have to take my opinion. And then when do I just want to be told what's going on? How you construct this RACI chart makes a huge difference in your exit strategy as to what roles you need on your leadership team. And most importantly, it makes a difference in how do you, when you bring talent in, especially externally, how do you make sure they know where they're supposed to operate? Or even as you're promoting people, it's a way to show, look, today I'm involved as an owner, but 2 years from now, I want you to have the skills to do this without me being in it, because I don't want to be accountable for any of this. So you have to be able to do it without me. But putting this on paper helps you figure out not only like your processes today, but what development and talent do you need for the future? What's your succession plan to get to that org structure for the future? And then how do you demonstrate, especially if you're selling to someone else, how do you demonstrate to others that this is a viable, sellable business that operates without you in the middle of it? Now, a couple of keys to success on the RACI chart. I mentioned a few of these. Always use roles, not names, because people change. You need it to be based on the role that the person is doing. Even when you put owner in there, in one of those boxes, you have to spend time thinking about, yes, I'm doing it today as the owner, but is that because I don't have somebody else in this role? So for example, in financial acumen, I don't have a controller today. So it'd be really easy to say that making the budget is an owner's responsibility. Really, it's the controller's responsibility. I just happen to also wear the controller hat internally. Make sure you do multiple versions of the RACI chart. So you need to look at this 6 months out, 1 year out, and 3 years out, depending on how far out your ultimate exit strategy goes. And then again, making sure you limit how often an owner, the actual owner title, even not their other hats, but the owner title is in the responsible or accountable, because if they're in there too much, makes it too hard, particularly if you plan to sell the business. Going into policy side of things, there's a couple of things on policies that are really key that often get overlooked. And I'm going to talk about these specifically in terms of the types of exit strategies that these become important in. So, for example, in a merger and acquisition, the things that you need to worry about are policies that increase the value of the business. So, for example, we'll talk about like PTO policy is one. If you are only offering the bare minimum of paid time off, well, if I go to sell the business, if that business that's buying me offers a fairly rich PTO policy or even a more standard PTO policy, so say you only allow 5 days of paid time off a year because that's all you want to build into the budget. Well, the standard in the industry is 2 to 3 weeks, depending on if you use vacation versus a PTO policy. Well, if company with a standard policy comes in and they're trying to buy you, they're immediately going to look at that and say, wow, we're going to have to increase the expense line for paid time off because we're going to match our policy. And so right there, it brings down the value of your business because they're going to have an expense you aren't incurring today. So you want to think about how your policies can actually increase the value of your business. You have to make sure they will pass due diligence. I share a story. We had a client call us a couple of years ago, and they were in a panic to have an employee handbook done, and immediately. I'm like, great, happy to do it. Usually if you're in a panic to have your employee handbook done, something's gone very wrong. So we need to know the backstory. And their backstory was they were a small business that was related, tied to the cannabis. They were like a vertical to the cannabis industry. The number one company in their industry called and wanted to buy them. And they went through some of the early due diligence work and gave them a letter of intent for approximately $8 million. They were about a $2.5–3 million business. So it was a nice return. They got deeper into due diligence, and about day 2 after the folks on the due diligence team came out, and the first thing they asked for was, can we see your employee handbook and your job descriptions? And they had none. And they all looked at the company that was going to buy them, looked at them and said, you don't have an employee handbook? And they said, no. And they said, thank you very much, but we're walking away. That was a very, very expensive employee handbook. So having these things in place, if you're going through due diligence, you need to make sure that at minimum, the bare bones of your HR compliance is in place. You also have to think about how easily could your organization transition to a new ownership team. That means there needs to be strong culture. You need to have strong leadership that could operate without you being the center of attention, right? And you have to set up a culture that isn't based on like, look at me, I'm such a great person. It needs to be about the company is a great company and we're all doing this together. We also have to make sure that there are limited future risks. So you have to have policies like your harassment policies that are followed. You have to make sure that aren't set up for things like discrimination issues and things like that, so that there aren't surprises later. Because again, when they go through HR due diligence and a sale, they're going to look for, is there any risk that somebody who was an employee under the old company could still come back and sue the company for legal issues? And then most importantly, you've got to make sure you can attract top talent, because you cannot achieve your exit strategy if you don't have really great talent. And if you don't have great policies like paid time off policies and benefit policies, and even just like flexible work arrangements or telecommute or any of these kinds of things that really do define your culture and how much you trust people, you're going to end up in a space that you're not going to have the kind of culture you want, which is going to impact the value of the organization from a merger perspective. On the family succession plan, you've got to make sure that you've got ease of transition to the next generation. You do not want to transition to the next generation and have them be the ones that have to come in and be like, So we haven't had any rules before, but now we're going to have to put in policies because like I'm going to be the tough guy, right? Like that's not a good feeling. And so you have to, in everything you do from a policy perspective, you need to be thinking not just about how do I want to run the business, but more importantly, how might someone else want to run this business? And then the ESOP and the retire in place. You've got ease of transition matters, promoting engagement matters because it's really, really important in an ESOP or retire in place situation. And then obviously you've got to make sure that your owner is out of the day-to-day, which means you've got to get top talent in the door. In order to do that, all of this, there's a couple of things that have to happen from a policies perspective. I told the story about the employee handbook. You have to not only have a handbook, you have to have a great employee handbook. And great employee handbooks they cover everything you need from a compliance perspective, but more importantly, they also define, here's our company culture, and your policies support that culture. So you don't have a company culture that you're like, hey, we trust people, we empower people, we want you to do great things. But your policies say, you know what, you have to walk up to your boss every morning and say good morning and sign a piece of paper to show you were truly there, right? Those would be a policy that doesn't support the culture that you want. And so even things like PTO, things like benefit plans, things like your telecommute policies, all of that makes a difference. The other reason it's super important though is you have to be competitive. So if your exit strategy is to hire a GM so that you can retire in place, well, you need to be able to attract the right GM to do that job. Controllers, very similar, right? Well, a lot of those talent people in those talent pools today aren't coming from your industry. They're coming from another industry. So in the landscape space, we've seen this a ton where when you hire people from other industries, they have rich paid time off policies, right? They're used to much more vacation. You can't compete in this market with the talent you want if you don't have those same kinds of benefits or same kinds of opportunities for things like telecommute and so forth. A couple of places that we see the biggest risks from an exit strategy perspective, talked about PTO, the harassment and discrimination policies. You've got to have really great policies in place. And particularly if you are a family-owned business, having an HR alert line in place so that you can show that you have limited the risk that particularly if you're selling, you limit the risk that when you sell the company, somebody comes back and says, hey, I was sexually harassed by the prior owner, because that is a very risky situation for somebody coming in to buy the company. And so that's an important part of this, is just making sure you can show that somebody is not at risk of inheriting. You can't ever predict things, but you've limited the opportunity for those kinds of things to happen. And having a third party who could address those issues is the key part to that. Thinking about work schedules, thinking about overtime requirements, making sure you are aligned on FLSA, Fair Labor Standards Act policies, and the changes that are coming all impact your exit strategy. And the last one, the most important one, is you've got to have good benefits. Not just benefits, but good benefits, including health insurance that, again, if you're going to, particularly if you're selling, you have to be in a position where the selling company won't come in and say, oh, wait a minute, it's going to cost me $100,000 more because I'm going to have to upgrade their insurance policy. And now you start seeing value in the business going down. In terms of proprietary information, there's two key pieces we want to talk about here. The first one is the non-disclosure agreement. Non-disclosure agreements are absolutely important and can just be included in your employee handbook. But non-disclosure agreements talk about limiting somebody's ability to share information. This is why it's all about the proprietary stuff. It protects your trade secrets and your client lists. Your employee handbook needs to have a non-disclosure agreement in it. And in some businesses, depending on the amount of proprietary information, it is possible you might want somebody to sign a separate non-disclosure agreement. Depends on the industry. That is different from a non-compete agreement. A non-compete limits the employee's ability to work in this particular industry in a particular territory or area. I caution people greatly against non-competes. First and foremost, they're actually illegal in several states, and that number of states is growing. Secondly, they're about to potentially be banned at the federal level. So if you have these in place, have a conversation with us, find out what that means and what might the impact be to you. But oftentimes, even if you have them, I will tell you, many states find them, even if they're not illegal, they often are not enforceable. So we often do not encourage a non-compete unless there's a super unique situation. But in your exit strategy, understanding you need non-disclosure agreements in place. You absolutely have to have those for a good exit strategy. You better off not to have non-compete agreements in place. So we wanted to make sure people understood the difference. The other agreement that's in place that's important is this concept of key person agreements. As you build your exit strategy, you likely have people in your company that you're like, well, as owner, I could exit, but boy, if Susie left, Susie has like this technical expertise in this particular area. Or if your exit strategy as the owner has been, I hired a GM and I want my GM to run the business so I can exit or exit in place, then you want to make sure that when you exit, that person stays in place, or else all of the development into your exit strategy is gone. So key person agreements can be things like retention bonuses. So for example, if you're selling to another company, that GM role might not stay forever because the new company that buys you may have somebody that would take that role, but you need them to stay long enough for not only the acquisition to take place, but there might be a rule in the sale that, hey, if that person leaves, we get some sort of money back. And so these key person agreements will help caution against those things. Sometimes it can take the form of a guaranteed severance package. And then the other option, and we've done this quite a bit as we've been looking at hiring GMs for companies where the owner wants to kind of retire in place, is phantom stock options, so that the individual, basically it gives them stock in the company without them having like partnership like rights. They don't get to make decisions related to the company that would be typical for an owner or partner. But at the sale of the company, they get a particular percentage of the sale price. And so that can be a way to compensate people to stay on and build it to hit that exit strategy goal, and then stay on and stay in place along the way. Sometimes ESOPs will use key person agreements as well, because in an ESOP, if you lost one of those key players, can really have an impact on the ESOP long term. So it's another place where these key person agreements can be really helpful. And then the last topic we want to talk about today, although there's so much more we could put into this, I'm actually doing a 2-hour version of this in a couple of weeks. I'm like, that's going to be a lot easier. But this is about sellability, and particularly if you're going to head in any way either to a merger or acquisition, even if that's a sell to a partner or sell to a family member and or an ESOP, these HR due diligence concepts are really key. And HR due diligence is something that is often overlooked, because we think of due diligence in terms of, oh, let's make sure the financials are good and all of those types of things. And we figure, well, HR is probably just fine. And the reality is, in mergers and acquisitions, HR due diligence is its own line of the due diligence team, and is a really key part. The first thing are things like compliance. So you've got to make sure you could check the box on things like I-9 forms, employee handbooks, safety policies, and programs. Then you've got to think about risk, because that's what the purchasing company will be thinking about. And if you have risk out there, it makes your business either less likely to sell, or it makes it like it will bring down the value of the sale. And so you need to think about, do we have prior legal issues that could come back up or could cost somebody money in the future? They're going to want to know, what severance agreements have you issued in the typically they'll go last 5 years, because they want to understand why people left. And if the severance agreement was because there was some risk of possible suit, it gives them an idea of how much risk they're inheriting. They're going to want a list of all of the involuntary terminations and the reasons for those. Again, they're looking for, you might have fired somebody 6 months ago, but if they come back and sue the company, there's still risk to the new company in the sale. They're going to want to see your workers' comp claims and certainly anything you have related to OSHA, either violations or just even reporting. So for example, if you have an employee who is injured and they are hospitalized overnight, you are required by OSHA to report that to OSHA so that they can do and at least have record of it or do an investigation depending on the circumstance. And they will want to know if that has happened. So this is violations and reporting. That is a sliver of the HR due diligence side. We're actually doing a webinar coming up in a few weeks. I can't remember the date. Nicole will send it out. But we are doing a full webinar just on HR due diligence. Whether you're on the buy side or the sell side, what should you be thinking about from a due diligence perspective? But today, what we wanted to give you was this first layer of what are the things that you need to think about from a principal's perspective to make sure that you have all of the tools in place to build an exit strategy that allows the owner and or key members of your leadership team to transition out and have the company be in a sellable state, whatever sellable looks like, right? They just need to be able to exit the organization the way they want and still have the company continue in the way that it needs to. So hopefully this is super helpful. We are happy to make sure that we send slides out. We'll also send today's recording out to folks along the way. Like we always do, I'm happy to offer any of those folks that were on today or even watching recordings for registering for today. We always offer HR strategy sessions for free. This is one of the things we do is you get on with me. We talk through all the things, depending on where you're at in your exit strategy and what you need. We find out where you're at today and what your HR solutions need to look like and what your strategy needs to look like for the next 1 to 3 years, and just give you those recommendations. So it's just a way for you to even know, even if you have your own internal HR, it's another set of eyes to really understand what's important and what are some things that could help build you to the direction you need to go long term. I want to stop our sharing and also our recording there. Are there any questions